I asked for your most rancid, horrific, cringe-inducing, knees-weakening hot takes when it comes to Final Fantasy as a series. And oh boy, did you all deliver. Some of these hot takes are not only hot, but they're rancid, putrid. They burn the nostrils from the rancid stench that fills them. So today, let's don a gas mask and delve deep into the world of Final Fantasy hot takes. And we're going to start off with a pretty juicy one from Daniel Roth over here, with the only good part of 7 is the beginning. And honestly, I gotta disagree with this one completely. I think Final Fantasy VII gets significantly better after the Midgar section. I think the whole Midgar section serves as a great introduction to the overall game world and to Shinra as a whole, but there's various areas like Wall Market that's just kind of blur to me in the original, where I think they're just kind of confusing to navigate, and just overall, it's an okay time. I think it just picks up way more after Midgar when you get the whole world to explore, getting various side activities to do. When you unlock Gold Saucer, that's really fun. The game just opens up options-wise once you get out of Midgar, and I really appreciate that aspect of Final Fantasy VII. Our next hot take comes from Robbo over here, with Aerith's death was just filler. The scene barely has any emotional impact on Cloud besides that one moment, and maybe it's just because it's been a few years, maybe somewhere in the ballpark between 6 or 7, since I've beaten Final Fantasy VII. I don't remember this being the case whatsoever. Aerith's death served as the jumping off point for a lot of character development for the character of Cloud overall, and even Tifa there, while recontextualizing a lot about what we know with Cloud, because it really delves into his whole mental state and the problems and the trauma he's kind of suppressed over the years. I thought it was a really good dive into his overall psyche. It was one of my favorite aspects of the game. And the fact that you lose Aerith, not just in the story, but also gameplay-wise, sure, it sucks if you built her up and really dedicated a lot of XP to her, but there's some really good gameplay through storytelling through gameplay there, with no longer having Aerith even in the party. It feels like there's a hole in the party's heart, because you never really get another white mage like Aerith. You're gonna have to make someone else into that role, or give that role and split it up amongst various characters. I thought it was overall really well handled. Then we move over to the remake side of things with Mito Adams' hot take. Final Fantasy VII Remake wasn't all that great, Avalanche are kind of annoying, and the combat can be infuriating. Also, the tone is weird, mostly referring to the Wall Market section. Also, not big on how most characters act. Still looking forward to the remake though. I was also going to say that Final Fantasy XIII is a fun game with good characters, but it seems general opinion is shifting and more people are liking their game. I will say that Lightning is a far more interesting and better developed character than Cloud. That one, I almost dry heaved saying that one. And Final Fantasy XV is my favorite game in the series. Okay, where to start? Where to start? Personally, going back to that whole Midgar discussion from earlier, I think the remake does Midgar better than the original. It expands on it, fleshes it out, gives it more character. Avalanche are kind of annoying, I just fundamentally disagree with. Avalanche actually have character this time around, outside of just Barret and Tifa. I actually remember who Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge are in this game, and not just throwaway characters, meant to showcase that Shinra sucks. The whole plate collapse scene, I think, is really well handled in the remake. Just showing the death and despair and the tragedy that is able to rot, and the depths that Shinra is willing to sink to fuel their ambitions. Combat can be infuriating if you get caught up in a bunch of unblockable attacks, and sure, I'll agree with you there. But I disagree with the idea that the tone is being weird there. Wall Market is essentially Sin City for Shinra. Not Shinra, but for Midgar, and especially the whole slum market down there. So being bright and vibrant with neon lights everywhere makes sense. And also serves as a great point of brevity, not necessarily brevity, but levity, for Final Fantasy VII Remake as a whole. I don't want that game to be entirely grim dark like the original Midgar section kind of was overall. Because original Midgar was far more bite-sized in comparison to the remake, and with the remake expanding that out to a 40-hour section, you need to have a variety of tones. One, to feel like a Final Fantasy game, and two, to just keep the player interested. And I really liked how much character and personality Midgar had this go-around. I can't really talk about Final Fantasy XIII, we'll get to that, because I haven't played it, but I will say Cloud is probably my favorite Final Fantasy protagonist. Unless we're counting like Warrior of Light from Final Fantasy XIV. And with 15, yeah, I think that's a hard take, but honestly, I can understand why. Because we'll get to that one a little bit later as well with a future comment, but Final Fantasy XV was my first Final Fantasy as well, and despite the flaws, I still love it. Take a brief detour over to Final Fantasy VI. Zaylipoos here says, Final Fantasy VI deserves a remake. So here's my idea. I don't know if I want a Final Fantasy VII remake style for Final Fantasy VI. I love Final Fantasy VII Remake, don't get me wrong. I just think that style of game works more with 7's story and world than it would for 6. Because one of the aspects when it comes to 6 that I really do appreciate is how it overall handles the party aspect of the game. And how you have these various sections where you're able to split the party up to do various things and to defend various objectives. Final Fantasy VI thrives, and a large part of it is because of the fact that it's a turn-based game. So I think for Final Fantasy VI especially, I would want to see that turn-based style of combat preserved. Also, large chunks of Final Fantasy VI overall function in a large way, in my opinion, because it's kind of handled like a Saturday morning cartoon, or at least stylized in that way. And I think that whole top-down perspective that Final Fantasy VI elicits or utilizes really lends itself to that format. Kind of able to draw in more of the scene or more of the characters, while still retaining that goofy aspect to it. You could handle it in the way of a Final Fantasy VII Remake, sure you could. I don't really know what section of 6 really needs expansion on. One of the best parts of 6 is its pacing, in my opinion, and how certain sections are able to be kind of comedically fast-paced. And I just don't know how that would handle with, say, an over-the-shoulder camera style. However, I would love to see 6 revisited in some form or fashion. We did get the remaster with the Pixel remaster, but if they could somehow pull off a faithful adaptation of Final Fantasy VI into a different style, I would love to see how they could try. I would be down for that, because I think 6 is one of my favorite Final Fantasy games overall as well. Now, I don't know if this next one's necessarily a hard take, but I found it funny. We move over to Osmic here, who states that Final Fantasy VIII is basically Tetsuya Nomura's take on X-Men, particularly the Chris Claremont era. I haven't beaten Final Fantasy VIII, but I've beaten Disc 1 so far, and I gotta admit, you kinda got a point. It does kind of feel like X-Men, and now that I have that mental image, I'm never gonna be able to unsee it. And just thinking that Squall is like Wolverine or something, and it's all this has done is made me want to play Final Fantasy VIII again, and just try and beat it this time. Let's move back to Final Fantasy VII one more time to talk about Potato Archer's hot take over here. Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite games of all time, but I think most of the reason it's looked back on so fondly is nostalgia. This is the take that I've seen go around a lot. It's one of those like popular Final Fantasy VII takes that a lot of people like to say, and I don't understand why. But I played Final Fantasy VII back in like 2015 or 2016 for the very first time, and I fell in love with the game. Yeah, I think the art style and the overall graphical fidelity of the game aged like milk and rancid bird poo. However, the gameplay and story are still some of my favorites in the entire series. I love the materia system and how it let me customize each character. I think I made Tifa my Black Mage. Like, Final Fantasy VII just lets you do stuff like that. 6 as well. So a lot of the compliments I'll give to Final Fantasy VII in terms of the gameplay, I'll also give to 6. But I loved 7's world and the Gold Saucer and Raging Chocobos, was just really fun, and I really enjoyed the story of Final Fantasy VII. Is it confusing? Absolutely at times, especially when it comes to Sephiroth and his whole origin and all the various projects that Shinra had. It gets absolutely confusing, but the main points that are there, especially when it comes to Cloud and his backstory, are really compelling to me, and I really love what they did with Final Fantasy VII. I still think it's a really good game overall. I think a lot of the times we say a game is only good because of nostalgia, it's just because our gaming preferences change over time. And what we may have liked years ago is no longer the case. But for me, I played the game when I was relatively getting new into RPGs. And my tastes haven't really changed when it comes to RPGs. I still really love Final Fantasy VII overall. But if you played this game when you were a kid, and then you grow up and like 20 years later, your gaming preferences have probably changed from point A to point B there. So you may no longer look back on a game that you used to find so fun and engaging with the same awe and intrigue that you once held. Let's move over to Final Fantasy X real quick. Let's talk about Luke's hot take. Because honestly, I'm entirely in agreement here. Everybody who hates the laughing scene has never played the game, or even seen the entire scene. Thank you. Thank you. Normally I'm all for, yeah, people have different preferences and all that. But Final Fantasy X, the people that just say it has bad voice acting because of that one scene, clearly, in my opinion, just have not seen the actual scene, because the bad voice acting in that scene is the point. It's supposed to be an awkward laugh being conveyed because they're trying to find some reason to laugh in this world that constantly shoves death down your throat. I remember watching years ago a completionist video on Final Fantasy X, and he really went in on this issue, and I entirely agreed with him. The laugh was meant to be kind of cringe, because they were forcing themselves to laugh so they could eventually feel it, like fake it till you make it, kind of. And even later on in that scene, it becomes more natural laughing because they're genuinely having a good time there. I think it's a really well-handled scene overall. Now, I did say we would get back to Final Fantasy XIII, so let's move over to Poketrainer Alex's hot take. The Final Fantasy XIII trilogy is actually amazing. Now, I can't speak to the quality of Final Fantasy 13 because I haven't played it. I've seen a bit of Final Fantasy 13-3, and I gotta admit, I wasn't all that impressed with it, but this is one of the aspects of Final Fantasy that I feel a lot of people kind of miss out on, and that is the idea that not every entry is going to be for you. Each game tackles various different themes and concepts, different types of characters, and we all probably going to emotionally resonate with some more than others, and some of them we may just not even like at all. Personally, I'm not a fan of 12. That's just me, though. I do want to revisit it and try and replay it, and see if my opinions have changed since I first played it. I want to give it another bash, absolutely. But I have to admit, it's not for me. Why is that? Because the game just doesn't necessarily appeal to my preferences and what I look for in a Final Fantasy game. Nothing wrong with that. It just appeals to a different audience. Also, I don't like the protagonist. I think Ash should have been the protagonist for Final Fantasy 12. But we're talking about 13 here. 13, especially if you weren't around the Final Fantasy fandom or that whole community back in the day when 13 was still being released, people were not all that, let's say, satisfied, for lack of a nicer word, with 13 as a whole. There's a lot of pessimism in the community back then especially. There still is now, but I feel like a lot of people actually do enjoy 15 somewhat, and then a lot of people like Final Fantasy VII Remake. And 16 is shaping up to be a really cool game with Yoshi P, so I have a lot of hope with that game. But when it comes to 13, I heard so many criticisms about the characters, the world, the story, etc., including the gameplay, and I gotta admit, it didn't really inspire me to want to play it. I'm going to play it eventually, because it's one of the projects I want to do with the channel. I want to play through every Final Fantasy game that I can get my hands on. So I'll be able to formulate my own opinions for myself. But, so one of the things I feel like a lot of people kind of missed the point on, and that is you don't have to like something that other people like. You don't have to dislike something that other people dislike. We all have our own preferences and what we want out of a game and a story and a character and the world and the gameplay. We all have different things that we want out of Final Fantasy, and we may have different weights established how important a specific aspect of a Final Fantasy game is to us. Some people may say the turn-based gameplay is paramount, it's number one for them, and that's a fine opinion to have. Some other people will say story or characters or world or music, etc., are more important to them, or any combination thereof, and that's an entirely fine, legitimate standpoint to have. Because we're all just trying to have a good experience, and we all just want to find games that appeal to what we want to get out of the games. And if Final Fantasy 13 and the entire trilogy appeal to you personally, be proud of that. Be proud about the fact that you were able to find joy and happiness in something that other people couldn't. I don't think it's a matter of, oh, your standards are worse or better than others. Who cares about that argument? You were able to find something fun compared to someone else. You had a better time overall. That's something to be happy about, in my opinion. So let's move on over to Final Fantasy XIV really quickly here, because I kind of want to expand on this in a full-blown video. Let's go over to Gatz's Final Fantasy XIV hot take. Endwalker was a step down in quality from Shadowbringers, and the state of the game as a whole is worse due to it and the changes it brought with the meta and job design. Hopeful for 7.0 though. For me, I really miss Baja. I really miss having that grindable, open-world-esque area that can just go in, level up some alt classes or alt jobs, and progress through a whole storyline like that. I miss having Baja. For me, I don't particularly care about deep dungeons as much as I do those zones like Baja. So that, for me, is probably one of the reasons I would say I prefer Shadowbringers endgame over Endwalker. When it comes to job design, overall, I really like the DPS classes, or at least the DPS jobs. My main critique comes into the play with the tanks. I wish we had less tank homogenization. I really do. I'm hopeful for 7.0 in that regard, but yeah. Like I said, we'll probably make a full-blown video once we get like the 6.5-esque era for Final Fantasy XIV. Let's move on over to Final Fantasy XV. With Steven's opinion here, Final Fantasy XV is really bad, but the last campfire scene made me cry. Yeah. Final Fantasy XV was my first Final Fantasy game ever, and I love the game. I still do. It has a ton of flaws, systemic ones, some of that are really bad, and some flaws that are in key design aspects of Final Fantasy XV that make the quality of the product overall lesser for me. I think the plot is kind of really terrible and rushed, especially in the back end, where the game kind of feels like it's two different games that were just taped together with band-aids, bubblegum, and prayer. I like the open world, however, the combat can be very clunky, but there's aspects to the combat like the warp sword that I really enjoy. I think the magic system being consumable is a bad idea, but if it's in part to a greater magic system as a whole, I think there's a lot of value that could be there with 15's magic system, just how customizable some of those potion magics really can be. There's a lot of cool aspects to Final Fantasy XV, but it's brought down in a lot of ways through systemic flaws throughout critical pillars of the overall gameplay experience. However, the ending, though, is still one of my favorites in the entire game. In all of gaming, the ending of Final Fantasy 15 makes no sense when you explain it out loud. How a game can have a really terrible, badly explained, poorly paced plot, but have one of the best endings ever. It's really hard to make a coherent defense for that. And for me, I think the reason I really like Final Fantasy 15's ending is because it focused on the one aspect of the story that is really good. The 4 boys and Auden, just those characters. And it focused on the experiences that you had in the game up to that point with your party. And that's why it's a really good ending in my opinion. Because it focuses on the one part of the story that is really compelling. I wish they had more time to just make Final Fantasy 15 because the potential that was there for that world and that story, oh my god. And I'm so upset that the DLCs never got to be finished. I'm not that upset that we didn't get an alternate ending though, because I really, really, really liked the original ending. But yeah, there were a lot of other hot takes in here that just don't really bode well for discussion. Like, Final Fantasy is mid. Final Fantasy 7 is mid. There was one from Inky here that says Final Fantasy 9 is a slow, boring, and goofy-looking game that is impossible to take seriously. The problem I can't really go into that is because I haven't finished Final Fantasy 9. Though I will say, I think from the part of Final Fantasy 9 that I've played, which is up to the first character death, when the guy gets turned to stone, you know the scene. I think there is something to be said for Final Fantasy 9 and how it utilizes that goofy-looking aesthetic and really imaginative world to contrast with those very dark moments that the game already had from the bit of it that I've played. And yeah, if you don't mod the game to up the ATB generation, yeah, it's very slow in terms of the combat. But I think the game overall has a charm to it, and I need to see how it plays out for the rest of it, but I think the balancing act it's utilizing so far from what I've played with the goofy-looking aesthetic to the very grim, dark moments and very serious moments that it can have, I think it makes it a better story, at least from what I've played so far. And there was another one by CR in here that says Final Fantasy X is just as much of a hallway simulator as Final Fantasy XIII. The community just dogpiles on 13 because of mob mentality. Again, I need to play Final Fantasy XIII before I can do a proper comparison, but for me with Final Fantasy X, I didn't mind the hallway aspect of its level design overall, because the gameplay that was there with Final Fantasy X's turn-based gameplay was so much fun that I didn't mind. Like, sure, the level design could be better, but the other aspects of 10 are so good that I was willing to put up with the level design overall because of the other parts I wanted to play through. When it comes to 13, I've heard way more systemic flaws or just personal opinions when it comes to 13 as well, where people didn't like the combat or didn't like the characters as well. So, being a hallway simulator would have just been another thing thrown on top of the pile for reasons that people don't like that game or that series. But yeah, there were quite a few other takes I want to get into, so there probably will be a part 2 to this series at some point. So if you want to see a part 2, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Go play some video games. Leave a comment down below with your hot takes for Final Fantasy as a whole. Or leave a comment down below with what your favorite Final Fantasy is and why. What's your story with it? I would love to hear your thoughts and hear your story behind it. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day. Go play some video games if you can. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody.